On a Tuesday morning in February, I was sitting at my kitchen table eating toast when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I didn't. The man on the other end introduced himself as a paralegal representing one of the largest retail corporations in my state. He was polite, almost friendly. And then, in the same calm tone you'd use to read a grocery list, he told me that his client had filed a civil lawsuit against me for $1 million in damages, and that I had been officially served. I was a 34-year-old guy who ran a small e-commerce business from a spare bedroom. I drove a 6-year-old Honda. I had about $12,000 in my savings account, and a corporation with 17 floors of lawyers had just decided I was worth suing for $1 million. What they did not know, what they could not have possibly anticipated, was that the moment they filed that lawsuit, they handed me everything I needed to take them apart. 14 months later, I walked out of a courthouse with a $4 million settlement, not a judgment. A settlement meaning they paid me to stop talking about what I had found. This is that story, and I promise you, you will not see the ending coming. My name is James. I'm going to be careful with certain details, not because I'm ashamed of any of this, but because the settlement agreement has specific language about disclosure that my attorney reminds me about regularly. What I can tell you is that everything I'm about to share is real, documented, and in several cases, part of the public court record. I ran a small online business selling specialty home goods, custom items, mostly handmade or sourced from small independent makers. Nothing glamorous. It paid the bills, gave me flexibility, and let me be my own boss, which had always been the only thing I ever really wanted. I had been operating for about 4 years when all of this started. I had a good reputation, a loyal customer base, solid reviews across every platform I sold on. I wasn't getting rich, but I was genuinely proud of what I had built. The corporation, let's call them Meridian Group, was a large retail chain that sold home goods across several states. They had physical stores, a robust e-commerce presence, and a legal team large enough to field a baseball team with 2 full benches. I had never had any direct dealings with Meridian Group. As far as I knew, they didn't even know I existed. Until the lawsuit. Once the shock wore off, which took about 24 hours and approximately 4 cups of coffee, I got myself a copy of the actual complaint and sat down to read it. Their claim was this. Meridian Group alleged that I had deliberately copied the trade dress of one of their flagship product lines. Essentially, that my packaging and branding were so similar to theirs that customers were being confused, and Meridian was suffering economic harm as a result. I want to be very clear. My branding looked nothing like theirs. I'm not saying this defensively. I'm saying it because it's a fact that was later confirmed by 2 independent expert witnesses in the case. My products were in a completely different color palette. My logo had no structural resemblance to theirs. The packaging format was different. Even the target customer demographic was different. This was not a case of accidental similarity. This was not a gray area. What it was, I came to understand later, was a tactic. Meridian Group had apparently been pursuing this strategy for some time, targeting small independent sellers in the home goods space, filing aggressive intellectual property complaints, and banking on the fact that most small business owners would fold immediately rather than face the cost of a legal defense against a corporation with essentially unlimited legal resources. It worked. Apparently, it had worked on at least a dozen small business owners before me, all of whom had settled quickly, quietly, and for amounts that were devastating to them personally but essentially rounding errors for Meridian. They expected me to do the same. They picked the wrong guy. Let me be honest with you about what the first 2 weeks looked like. Because the version of this story where I immediately stood up, pounded my fist on the table and said, I will fight them to my last breath would be a lie. The first 2 weeks looked like barely sleeping. Like calling my parents and trying to explain $1 million lawsuit without my voice breaking. Like Googling, what happens if you can't pay a civil judgment at 2 in the morning? Like watching my business analytics and seeing my sales drop because somehow, somewhere, word had gotten out that I was involved in litigation and customers were nervous. I spoke to 3 different attorneys in those first 2 weeks. The first one told me to settle and gave me a number he thought Meridian would accept. The second said the case was winnable, but warned me that the legal costs could easily exceed what I'd spend just settling. The third, a woman named Patricia who specialized in IP litigation and had a small firm about an hour from where I lived, said something that none of the others had said. She said, "Before we talk about how to defend you, let me ask you something. Have you looked at what Meridian has actually been doing in the market? Because nothing about the timing of this lawsuit makes sense unless there's something else going on. I hadn't. I hadn't thought to. Patricia had. And what she had found in the 48 hours since I first called her was the thread that would eventually unravel everything. Patricia had done what good lawyers do before anything else. She had looked at the history. Meridian Group had filed 11 similar lawsuits against small independent sellers over the previous 22 months. 11. Every single one of them had settled before reaching discovery, the phase of litigation where both sides are legally required to disclose documents and evidence to each other. Every single one. Patricia's theory was straightforward and devastating. Meridian wasn't filing these lawsuits because they believed they had legitimate IP claims. They were filing them as a business strategy, to eliminate small competitors and independent sellers in their market space before those sellers could grow large enough to matter. And by settling before discovery every time, they ensured that no one ever got to look inside the machine. If we don't settle, Patricia told me, and we push this to discovery, we're going to see things they have never wanted anyone to see. I asked her what she thought we'd find. She said, I think we'll find that they knew their claims weren't valid. And if we can show that they knew and filed anyway, we're not just defending you anymore. We're looking at potential abuse of process, malicious prosecution, and possibly violations of federal unfair competition law. We're looking at a countersuit. I sat very still for a moment, then I told her, let's not settle. Filing the countersuit was one of the most surreal moments of my life. There's something almost out of body about signing legal documents that demand $4 million from a corporation that had, 8 weeks earlier, been the thing keeping me awake at 3 in the morning. Patricia filed the counter-complaint on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, Meridian's legal team had called her. By the following Monday, they had requested an expedited call to discuss resolution. They had not done that with any of the previous 11 defendants. Patricia told me afterward that when a corporation's legal team requests an expedited resolution, call the moment a countersuit is filed, it usually means one of two things. Either they think the countersuit has no merit and they want to dispose of it quickly, or they are genuinely frightened of what discovery will surface. The speed of that call told her which one it was, but we didn't take the first meeting, or the second, because Patricia had taught me something critical by this point. In litigation, especially against a larger opponent, time is often a weapon. Every week we didn't settle was another week Meridian's legal team was billing hours. Another week their executives were sitting in depositions they hadn't planned for. Another week the story of what they had been doing to small businesses lived in the legal record. We let them sit with it. When we finally entered the discovery phase, what came out of Meridian's internal documents was worse than even Patricia had expected. I can't share specifics due to the settlement agreement. What I can tell you is that the documents produced during discovery showed, in writing, communications between members of Meridian's legal and strategy teams that directly contradicted their public position on their IP claims. There were emails, there were internal memos, there were meeting notes. Patricia described it when she called me after reviewing the first batch of documents as a gift. She has a very dry sense of humor. What the documents showed, in general terms, was a pattern of deliberate, coordinated action that was not about protecting legitimate intellectual property. It was about market suppression, about using the legal system as a scalpel to cut away competition that a company of Meridian's size found annoying rather than threatening. And they had done it knowing that the claims were legally thin, because they had never expected anyone to push back far enough to find out. When Meridian's attorneys saw what was in their own documents, or rather, when they saw that we had seen what was in their documents, the tone of every communication changed overnight. The calls became more frequent. The offered settlement numbers, which had started insultingly low, began moving in a direction that told me everything I needed to know about how worried they had become. There was one specific moment, one phone call, that I think about more than any other in this entire 14-month journey. Patricia called me on a Wednesday evening, about 11 months into the case. I could tell from her voice that something had changed. She told me that Meridian's lead attorney had reached out that afternoon with a number. A real number, not an opening offer designed to test us. A number that meant they wanted this over. It was above $4 million. I remember I was standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had eaten toast the morning this all started, and I genuinely didn't know what to do with my hands. I walked in a small circle. I sat down, I stood up again. Patricia said, James, listen to me. This number tells you something important. It tells you that what we found scared them enough to pay $4 million to make it go away. That's not nothing. That's everything. She was right. We negotiated the final terms over the following 6 weeks. The settlement was confidential in its specifics, hence the careful language throughout this video. But the number, which I can confirm, was above $4 million. Meridian Group paid me to walk away. The same company that had cold-called me on a Tuesday morning and told me I was being sued for $1 million paid me 4 times that amount to stop the legal process that their own lawsuit had set in motion. I want to tell you what the aftermath actually looked like, because I think and then everything was perfect, ending would be dishonest. The settlement changed my financial situation significantly. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. That kind of money, for someone who had $12,000 in savings when this started, is genuinely life-altering. I paid Patricia, obviously. I paid taxes. I set aside a significant portion and did not touch it for a full year on her advice, until I was sure about exactly what I wanted to do with it. My business, which had taken a real hit during the litigation period, recovered slowly, then faster, then fully. I actually think the story of what happened, which became known in certain small business communities online, brought me customers who specifically wanted to support someone who had stood up to a large corporation. There was something I hadn't expected in the aftermath, people rooting for me even after the fact. Meridian Group, from what I can observe in publicly available information, has not filed a similar lawsuit against an independent seller since the settlement. I don't know if that's directly connected to our case. I can't know that, but I notice it. And the attorney who cold-called me that Tuesday morning, the paralegal, I mean, the one who delivered the news so casually while I stood there holding a piece of toast, I actually thought about him a lot during this whole process. He was just doing his job. He had no idea what he was handing me when he made that call. He called it a lawsuit. It turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to my business. I'm not telling this story to make myself sound like some kind of hero. I had an exceptional attorney who did the real work. I had enough financial runway to survive the early months before the settlement talks got serious. I had access to resources that a lot of small business owners facing the same situation wouldn't have. I got lucky in ways that I fully acknowledge, but I also made one decision that changed everything. I didn't fold the moment it got expensive and scary. Not because I was brave, exactly. I was terrified for most of this. But because something in me refused to accept that the size of the opponent was supposed to determine the outcome automatically. If there is one thing I want you to carry out of this video, it is this. The people and organizations that use power as a substitute for legitimacy are always more fragile than they appear. They look enormous from the outside, but their size is also their weakness, because there is more inside them to uncover, more history to surface, more documents to produce in discovery. The bigger they are, the more they have to hide. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the best thing they can do is hand you exactly the weapon you need to take them apart, in the form of a lawsuit they never expected you to fight. If you've ever been bullied by a system, a corporation, an institution, or anyone who assumed that their size meant they had already won, drop a comment below. I want to hear your story. And if you want to hear what happened in the year after the settlement, including one decision I made with the money that almost went very wrong, subscribe and hit the bell because that story is coming. One last thing. If you know someone who is going through something like this right now, a small business owner, a freelancer, anyone facing something that feels too big to fight, share this video with them. Not because my story guarantees theirs ends the same way, but because sometimes the most important thing is just knowing that fighting back is a choice that exists. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.